Welcome. My name is Karen Young. I'm a senior resident scholar here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. And it's my pleasure today to welcome our guests, but also to speak on behalf of our president, Ambassador Marcel Waba, who could not be here today because her husband has fallen ill. He's going to be okay, but that's the reason why she's not in my place. So please join me in welcoming Her Excellency, Minister of State Reem Al Hashimy, and Ambassador Yusuf Al Hodeidah is also with us today. And we're hoping to have an informal conversation, though it is on the record, about some of the work that Minister Al Hashimy is doing in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, in international cooperation, and what she sees as some of the challenges that the UAE government is facing in its foreign policy right now. So please let me offer a few words to introduce her. I'm sure you're familiar with her portfolio and her background, but she was appointed in February 2016 as Minister of State for International Cooperation. She's been with the federal government since 2008 and has had an important role is helping prepare for Expo 2020, which I hope we'll all be able to attend and participate in, because I think it's going to be really exciting, as a Director General. She also manages the International Affairs Office for His Highness Mohammed bin Rashid in Dubai, the Prime Minister of the UAE, and holds responsibility within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for UAE bilateral relations with India, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, and small island developing states. She began her career here in Washington as the commercial attaché in the UAE Embassy, and then became the Deputy Chief of Mission. And one thing that I learned about you, which I was really impressed by, is that you're also a chair of Dubai Cares, which is such an impressive organization and I think speaks to your commitment to humanitarian issues. And we're going to talk about those in action today. So this is how we'll proceed. We're going to give about 10 minutes or so for your comments, and we're going to save lots of time for discussion, so start thinking about your questions. Pause for your question to be sure that we can pass a microphone to you and introduce yourself. But I give the floor now to Minister Reem Al Hashimy.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, and a very lovely afternoon to you all. I came to Washington, D.C. yesterday to primarily speak to relevant stakeholders about the current humanitarian situation in Yemen, and also to reflect a little bit what the UAE is working very actively in trying to promote alongside our other coalition colleagues. The continuous hemorrhage of the humanitarian situation in Yemen is really quite appalling. We're quite concerned about how bad it has gotten over several years, if not more. And we believe very strongly that the political challenges that continue to exist with the different factions in Yemen has led to a very large degree to this spiraling down of the humanitarian crisis. We are very we are very keen on the Special Envoy's role, Mr. Martin Griffith, in trying to put forward a peaceful overall plan for Yemen. And after some discussions with him this morning, but also conversations with him in Abu Dhabi, we feel that he's onto something that might actually help us develop a framework that will help Yemen as a whole. I'm also quite committed to ensuring that we work rather closely on some of the most immediate needs right now. Most immediately, as you all know, and certainly the humanitarians around the table are quite aware of, food, shelter, water and sanitation and fuel are really important priorities. Unfortunately, the Houthis continue to violate international humanitarian law and continue to put civilians at risk. They continue to indiscriminately plant landmines. In fact, the numbers I'm looking at are around 800,000 or so, really putting everybody at significant danger, but not only from the landmines, but because as they plant these, they also uproot some of the infrastructure that is there, and the water pipes also get damaged and broken. And so this helps bring the onset of disease, and also makes the repair of these things more challenging, certainly for the city of Hodeidah itself. In my meetings, both in Washington and also in New York prior to coming to DC, I've met with different international organizations from the UN family, such as UNICEF and UNDP and others, to really look through what are some of the measures that the UAE can continue to push forward with them in ensuring that we do the best that we can for the people in Yemen in general, but also for the people in Hodeidah more specifically. Karen mentioned briefly as well that we have interest in sub-Saharan Africa. I've been privileged to carry this file for almost 9 years. And it's been a great privilege, actually. I've really enjoyed working in sub-Saharan Africa. And most recently, as some of you may know, there's been a rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and that has been incredibly positive. And the UAE has played a humble role in trying to bring these two countries together, and something that we're very proud of and want to continue to help foster. But I would also be remiss not to say that the leadership of both of these countries have actually been the ones that have helped us get here too, and that must not be understated. I also think that if we took a step back and tried to look at what the Dubai World Expo 2020 is trying to do, because somehow this all needs to fit in one way or another in my portfolio, I would say that at a time when there's increasingly more sort of us versus them and more of the other that is being put forward, a world exposition tries to actually bring people together, united in a common theme and common sub-themes. And ours for 2020 is Connecting Minds, Creating the Future. We're excited about it. I'm personally very involved in it because I think for at least a period of 6 months, if we have countries from all around the world present that are talking through and talking about their vision for what Connecting Minds, Creating the Future looks like, we have an opportunity to really forge new paths, certainly around the Sustainable Development Goals, which is an entity or a mission that we're taking very seriously, but also things around innovation and certainly ways in which we can creatively address some of the problems of tomorrow by looking at creative ways. I truly believe that the challenges we face is not for lack of new solutions. It's just primarily bandwidth and scale. And if we could try to bring those two elements to the table, we may actually be able to push the needle on some of these important matters. So with that, I would love to hear from you, and I would love to learn also what your perspectives are on not only the topics I mentioned, but things that may be more relevant or more broad. And I look forward to an interesting hour and a half. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I might take the privilege of the first question, and then Joyce has already got her hand up, so we'll go to her after that. Yeah. We were going to hear a lot from Joyce today, I'm sure, but that's fine. I'm personally very interested in studying how the UAE's foreign policy is expanding in scope, or what we might see as a sphere of influence, which isn't just about the Gulf anymore, but more about the whole peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, and extending outwards, and then to the west, to the Horn of Africa. And I understand now there's been a recent commitment of investment into South Africa as well. So that's within your purview, I imagine. How are these, the regions, especially the Horn and sub-Saharan Africa, why is this an economic and security priority for the UAE?
Sort of goes a little bit to what I left you guys off with, which is everything is increasingly interdependent and interconnected. Ethiopia, for example, is 4 hours away from the UAE and 100 million people. There are plenty of intricacies in how our region deals with one another, and how the Arab world and Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and I would even argue the rest of the world interact with one another. Today, we don't have the luxury of saying, I have nothing to do with that. Some of these things actually spill over all across. And so there's a deep conviction from our side that to be able to maintain stability and prosperity, the region as a whole has to improve. Socioeconomic indicators need to also improve, which is why we also invest heavily in our own region to ensure that those metrics get better.
Thanks. So we'll open the floor to your questions. If you can put your placard that way. They're not very stable. If you want to just get my attention, that works too. I'll make a list. Wait for the microphone. Introduce yourself. We are on the record. So Joyce, you are first. There's a microphone coming behind you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Karen, for the Arab Gulf State Institute. Your Excellency, wanted to ask you more about your meeting this morning with the UN envoy. Are you more optimistic about a breakthrough in Hodeidah? And if that's the case, would it be around the 4-point plan that the Arab coalition had put forward last month? And on the situation, the talks between Ethiopia and Eritrea, we saw the first flight, commercial flight today in 20 years between the two. What is next? You would like to see from, in this process? Thank you.
We continue to believe very strongly that a complete and unconditional withdrawal of port and city by the Houthis and in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2216 is necessary. Martin is receiving feedback from the different entities, and I would leave it to him to judge how this is moving. But we continue to believe in the role that he's playing, in the critical role that he's playing, and continue to believe that this could be an opening for a larger potential peaceful settlement in Yemen as a whole, and not only in Hodeidah. As for Ethiopia and Eritrea, they will determine the pace and the scale that they see best. What we've seen so far has been very positive and are very warmed by this warming of the relationship and very keen to see it continue to strengthen. We are, as you also have had received the Prime Minister in Abu Dhabi a couple of weeks ago and had reciprocated that visit less than a month after he came to Abu Dhabi by actually going to Addis Ababa. Those are all very strong signals of the strength of that relationship between us and between them.
Next we have Tony Verstandig, if I said that correctly.
Thank you very much.
Wait for the microphone right behind you, please. Thank you.
Great to see you again. So I'm going to wear a different hat, and that's my hat as board chair, foundation board chair here at Children's Hospital. And the UAE has been extraordinary in terms of the leadership on pediatric health care. And I'd like you to lift up, you mentioned Dubai 2020 and also reference to the SGDs. But you've been, the Emirates has been a leader in global health and partnered with Bill and Melinda Gates on eradicating polio. So can you sort of move us forward? You will soon be hosting the Gavi midterm review, and it creates an incredible opportunity to actually connect your dots. And I'm very interested in how you framed that basket of issues on innovation and creativity. And I'd like to just hear more about what the landscape might be.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. It's also very nice to see you again. We started our polio campaign with BMGF probably 2010, 2011, I would say. And at that time, there were 4 countries that still had polio incidents: Nigeria, India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And over the years, with considerable effort from many involved and a considerable financial commitment as well, we've been able to limit this down to an area called the Federal Autonomous States between the Pakistan and the Afghani border. And for me, who has had the privilege of working on this campaign from the very beginning, it's been an incredible journey, but it also demands intense stamina. Because if you do have polio resurgence, then you have to almost not start from scratch, but you have to move incredibly aggressively, because what we're talking about is eradicating this disease from the face of the earth. Likewise, we've also been involved, and this was a very interesting story, we've been involved in the eradication of guinea worm. What I hadn't known when I started working on this with the Carter Foundation was that Sheikh Zayed in the early 90s was one of the first people to give a commitment for guinea worm. And then His Highness Sheikh Khalifa put in the last amount to bridge for the eradication. And if you believe in karma and if you believe in how things come full circle, we on the UAE side certainly didn't know that Sheikh Zayed at that time gave $6 million. The way and the nature of all of this connectivity, if you will, is our plight as human beings is as bonded and as connected to one another as ever. And we have to collectively, we're very big believers in the Emirates, in not only pluralistic societies, but in the power of partnership and collaboration. There isn't one thing that any one entity can do, no matter how strong or mighty that one entity is. We have to work and partner with others and find other voices. It's more difficult sometimes to bring and almost herd all the cats, but it's necessary, because by doing so, you have more stakeholdership also built in. When you talk about innovation, the first thing that comes to mind is how you have an initiative called Infuse that Gavi has put forward, where they distribute blood through drones in Rwanda. And the pleasure of working in sub-Saharan Africa is you can, for me at least, I am privy to some of these types of projects where nations don't almost need to go through the traditional phases of development. They can skip a phase or two. And if you have leadership as strong and as enlightened as that in Rwanda to actually bring this type of prosperity and innovation to their country, you'll have an opportunity to actually transport blood through the hillsides of Rwanda through the use of drones. Having said that, the Gavi midterm review later on in the year in Abu Dhabi is an opportunity for us to explore these types of innovations, but also to try to bring them to scale. As you probably also know, the UAE is one of the largest, it's actually the largest donor as a percentage of our GNI, but being large isn't the interesting thing. It's how do we try to bring some of these things to scale? Because if we are able to infuse, no pun intended, these types of projects in a larger developmental framework in some of the places where we're working in, such as Egypt, for example, or Sudan, or other places, then we would be able to really get the kinds of impact that we're interested in. And the Expo could be a platform where some of this ends up being showcased.
And Reem is the expert here, but I'll just add this observation. When Sheikh Zayed donated money to President Carter for the guinea worm project, there was no Bill and Gates Melinda Foundation. There wasn't the history, or there wasn't the infrastructure that we have now to do this better and to do this more efficiently. So I think we've been building on this for a long time, but I think that the ecosystem that works on this is also better positioned and better qualified today to reach a goal like eradicating polio. And even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as big as it is, couldn't do it without the partnerships that they brought on board to do it in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I think it's, if you map it back, it's been a really interesting journey, but I think we're probably better positioned to have a bigger impact today than we've ever been.
Thank you. I think Ambassador Susan Ziada is next. We'll have a microphone for her, please. There you are.
pleasure to have you here with us. Is this on? Yeah. Can you please address the issue back to Hodeidah, an issue I dealt with for a long time when I was in the State Department? I guess my question is now, of course, we're in the battle of the public affairs battle of, you know, the Houthis saying one thing, your government saying another, what's coming out of the Yemeni government in terms of what each side is willing to do in terms of trying to move forward on Hodeidah. Whether the Houthis saying, okay, the UN can supervise and observe and be there, but Emirati forces cannot be there, etc. So two questions. One, I understand the UN will come up with a position, and I'm sure that Mr. Griffith is here in part to come to some kind of conclusion in terms of where general support would be for his position. But how much flexibility do you feel that the Emirati government is willing to show on this issue in a way to at least start to build some confidence-building measures to try and move the process forward? That's one. And two, in the past, there have been different perspectives between your Saudi partners and the government in, the legitimate government in Yemen under President Hadi, and your government in terms of actual strategic goals, in terms of what makes sense in bringing all the partners to a political process, and what has to be achieved on the ground in order to get the partners to understand we have to look at this from a political perspective. So can you address the issue of where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are in terms of the issue of how to move forward on Hodeidah? Thank you.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are very aligned in our conviction that the special envoy has all the tools that he needs to make sure that he can bring as best a solution as possible that is not necessarily only related to Hodeidah, but that could also offer the opportunity of something a lot larger. And really the legitimate government of Yemen and the Houthi rebel militia who are in conversations with Martin Griffith, as this is a negotiation, it's actually incredibly fluid, and he would be the best and frankly the only person to be able to speak to it with strength and also with legitimacy. From our standpoint, we want a strong and stable Yemen that is not a proxy to others in our region, that will not create a bedrock of a Hezbollah type operation south of the Saudi border, nor would it compromise international maritime routes. And that is really where our intent is vis-a-vis Yemen, and our focus is vis-a-vis Yemen. We also think that the humanitarian crisis that has already lost a generation, that is risking the loss of yet another, is something that we have to very seriously address. In the last 3 years alone, the UAE and Saudi have put in $15 billion US, yet you still have remarkably challenged statistics on basic health care, on basic nutrition to the most vulnerable in society. We believe that this is untenable and cannot continue, and it's not about additional financial commitment. The system and the ground is not working, and there has to be a measure that looks at something a lot broader. I don't want to comment on specifics about the port per se versus the city, because like I said earlier, that's really Martin's purview, but also what we're encouraging and what he, I believe, is also encouraged by is seeing how we could actually explore a much larger solution for this, and that's where we are maintaining very close collaboration and contact with him and with others to ensure that we can get there. I visited Aden last week, or maybe 10 days ago right now, and met with President Hadi and met with several ministers as well in his government, as well as the Prime Minister. Very happy to see that Aden is picking up. Aden port is also picking up. There's still a long way to go, though, and I think that's also been the position of the legitimate government of Yemen themselves. We believe very strongly in their need to also carve out what that destiny looks like. Yemen for the Yemenis, and then it's for them to decide how they want to work through their own individual perspectives. But we continue to be supportive of them, and we continue to show our commitment to the Yemeni population.
We have a question from Ambassador Barbara Leaf.
Reem, I think it goes without saying that touching on this last point of President Hadi and his relationships, going further, his relationships with Abu Dhabi in particular, having been, it appears over this last period, mended in some fundamental sense, that has been to the larger good of this effort that is underway by Martin Griffiths and with the full support of the coalition to drive towards a larger political process. But I guess what I'm still wondering is, if you go back in time to the events of 2010, 2011, you had a GCC-wide effort to provide the underpinning to a critical transition for that country, and it was working until, of course, it was undermined by Saleh and the Houthi. Given the splits in the GCC family, do you consider that an important deficit this time around, or do you see a pathway where, notwithstanding the still extant rift in the GCC family, you might nonetheless, as a collective of countries, come together in a common approach to Yemen?
I don't see that the rift has a significant bearing in how Yemen is currently moving. I think there are much larger and much more deeper challenges within Yemen itself. And as Martin tries to broker a deal, the GCC initiative, as well as the National Dialogue, as well as UN Security Council 2216, are the, if you will, legal underpinnings of helping to push forward that. So I don't actually see an implication, if you will, on that front. I do, however, believe that as much as possible, aligned voices that can talk through the importance of peace in Yemen, that can condemn the smuggling of weapons that are directed at Saudi Arabia, that can ensure that Yemen finally gets a shot at trying to be a strong, stable country with dignified and prosperous people. That's something we should all be advocates of and aligned on. Armaments, arming, radicalization, as you know, Al-Qaeda in different pockets of Yemen, those are all incredibly destabilizing. And I believe we're all, the international community is actually all aligned on the importance of having Yemen be as secure as I've mentioned earlier.
And if I can add, let's be honest, the campaign in Yemen is 3.5 years old. The rift with Qatar is 1 year old. This is not going to affect the outcome. At the end of the day, the success or failure of Yemen will largely depend on the parties in Yemen and whether the Houthis and the government are able to come together. And this is why we're basically gone all in on Martin Griffiths' efforts. He was our first meeting today. I think we're seeing him again later today. But we are fully invested in the UN envoy's efforts. So this is not, I don't see an angle for the GCC rift to play either a harmful or positive role in this.
Thank you. We had a question from Eric Polovsky, and then we'll put Dave next and Kristen.
Thank you, Minister, for joining us. I guess you mentioned a couple times the interest in promoting a strong and stable Yemen, and you also mentioned early on the interest that all of us have, but UAE in particular has in the safe navigation around Yemen through the Bab el-Mandeb. I wondered if you might comment on whether your view about sort of the ultimate resolution and the future of Yemen and those two issues in particular are best served by a strong central government or some other configuration, given the relationship challenges that exist between the center and the south.
I really think, Eric, that's for the Yemenis to figure out. The calculus is theirs to own and to live by and to live with. From our standpoint, as long as that skeletal approach is addressed and as long as a political framework is put forward that they all sign up to and commit towards, then from our standpoint, we feel that that would help achieve the stable and strong Yemen that we want.
Can I just...
Sure.
Just to follow up on that a little, in terms of securing the navigation, the freedom of navigation that's so important to UAE, I would think that there are some permutations that are not going to be as successful in preserving that interest, and some that do so more effectively. Can you give any elaboration on that? I mean, because obviously I'm sure that your government has thought in quite detail about that.
The international maritime routes are not the UAE's concern alone. The international community is concerned about ensuring that these navigation routes remain safe and open, and etc. Again, the current status quo is dangerous. To have Houthi rebel forces controlling the port and the city is a very precarious situation to be in. What the overall setup would look like, I would defer to, and my government would defer to the Yemenis to decide as to what equation or calculus makes most sense to them. If at the end of this there is peace in Yemen, and all of the different voices have been integrated and what that looks like, we would be supportive of it if the special envoy pushes that one forward. And hence my earlier comment that Hodeidah could dovetail into a larger story here, and that's the part that's most interesting to us.
All right, we have a question from Dave Harden.
Thank you, Minister. It's nice to see you again. Sticking with Yemen for a moment, the evidence demonstrates that when a civil war is funded and fueled by external actors, that the war is neither short nor easy to resolve. And so we all hope that Martin Griffiths does a job that's great and is able to solve all of this. But the likelihood is that this is a multi-pronged civil war that's going to extend in the years ahead. Secondly, the humanitarian crisis is massive and uncontrolled, and yet it continues despite the fact that you've put in $15 billion and the UN is on the ground working very hard. So we haven't really turned the tide or the trajectory of the humanitarian crisis. So with that in mind, and recognizing that there's some economic incentives that continue the conflict as opposed to thwart the conflict, could you just describe your vision both for private sector economic opportunity to blunt the humanitarian crisis and to create an upcycle, and in addition, the relationship of your work and the international community's work on stabilization and how that's affecting the conflict and its dynamics? Thank you.
We're not disillusioned that this is easy. We know that this is complex, to say the least. And we're in eyes wide open, understanding the intricacies and these complexities. A very good point on private sector, actually. We're looking and have been looking at how we can help bring about, if you will, not just the top 10 folks that are quite strong in Yemen, but try to create more of a middle level, if you will, in enterprise and in business. So trying to support that. But also we're very keen on making sure that some of the other social factors, and one of the meetings I had in Aden was with their Minister of Social Affairs that talked about some forms of financing for women, for single families or single mother families, trying to make sure that whether it's orphans or it's other disenfranchised groups within society are also looked at in creative and innovative ways. I think I'm also very keen on highlighting the need for capacity building in Yemen. This is not as much about helping to finance something as it is also to try to help build up the necessary skill base. And I think that's an important component here as well. There was a second part to your question. So post-conflict is really critical for us as well. We've already looked at with different entities within the UN system how we could go ahead and stabilize, how we could go ahead and bring on a lives and livelihoods type of program in place that sort of dovetails with my earlier comment on the private sector. Certainly things like water reservoirs and stronger infrastructure are also elements that we've highlighted, but definitely post-conflict is something that we've already started having conversations on.
Good question. Next on my list is Kristen Duan.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I wanted to kind of press a bit further from the question that Karen started, which is thinking a bit more about the UAE's strategic outlook and strategic ambitions in the region. Karen spoke a bit more about the increasing activities that are taking place in Utah as well in the Red Sea. And we recently were able to speak to some of our Emirati partners who also talked about some priorities that the UAE has and kind of ambitions and showing some leadership in the Arabian Sea and kind of outreach as well to India and other partners. I guess I had just a general question about the UAE strategic priorities and how they want to achieve kind of what looks like a pretty ambitious agenda of playing a role, as you said, in like a pretty broad area. So can you just give us kind of a sense of the UAE strategic outlook in terms of the sort of political platforms, you know, it is a small country, that we kind of drawing upon to kind of exert leadership in these different regions. I know we've seen kind of the Saudi-UAE partnership be one key kind of alliance that has been working that way. And also just get a sense of your priorities as you look at all of these different challenges in the region and kind of which direction you want to go.
We have a pretty diverse approach to this that isn't necessarily underpinned geographically. It's where there's an alignment with particular leadership. So I would highlight, for example, Argentina is a place we're very interested in right now, or have been in the last several years. But then I would also highlight Sub-Saharan Africa, or rather Africa as a continent in general. Again, it's not so much geography, it's where there are market opportunities and there are also alignment with leadership. Obviously, the Indian subcontinent in general and India in specific, we've had incredibly strong ties and are even doing things trilaterally. Australia, New Zealand, we're receiving the president of China on Thursday in Abu Dhabi. Is it tomorrow already? Yeah. I have to be there for that. And I'm here with you now. It's very confusing. So there's really we received South Korea as well a couple of months ago. So it's South Africa 2 days ago. We are very keen on being responsible global players. I wouldn't call it ambition as much as I would call it an interest to forge strong ties that have meaningful impact. The leadership in the Emirates, when aligned with other leadership that sort of sees the potential, it becomes almost like it's almost like the right chemistry between nations and their peoples. And that's sort of what drives us to continue to push forward. I feel like he wants to jump in.
So one of the biggest drivers of this kind of new UAE that you're seeing is based in an economic vision of economic diversification. Today, UAE GDP is 70% non-oil and gas. That's a pretty impressive number for an oil exporting country. Our guidance from our leadership is how do we take that 70 and increase it and make our dependence on oil and gas even lower? And so if that's the driver and if that's the vision, there's absolutely no reason to not deepen and broaden your relationship with countries like India and China. It's a no-brainer that our largest trade partner, China, should not have a much larger relationship and broader relationship, both economically, politically, and so on. So today, China is our largest trade partner with 60 billion. When the President Jinping arrives tomorrow, we're signing an agreement that targets our trade to go from 60 to 150 billion. They're also our largest foreign direct investment in the UAE. So I think what you're seeing is, whether you want to call it ambitious or you want to call it more of a global player, it is being driven by where we want to be economically and politically 10 years from now or 20 years from now.
That was a great question. Thank you, Kristen, and I appreciate those answers. On my list now I have Stephen Pomper, then Peter Salisbury.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to shift focus a little bit to the Ethiopia-Eritrea rapprochement, which is truly a bright spot, and congratulations on the role that the UAE played in that. If you'll forgive a few relatively granular questions in that context, we're aware that in the context of these rapprochement conversations, there were indications that the UAE would be offering various forms of support and investment to the sides. And I believe that roughly 2/3 of a relatively sizable commitment to the Ethiopians is yet to be spoken for. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of how that amount, which may be in the realm of $2 billion, is likely to be spent. Sorry, there are 3 parts to this question. The second part is whether you can give us a sense of what might have been committed on the Eritrean side. And then the third part is, we know, of course, of your concern for Egyptian security and water security, and wonder whether in this context there were conversations about commitments that the Ethiopians might be making to the Egyptians about the water supply in light of the Nile Dam project.
I'm afraid I can't answer any of them. Mostly because these conversations are also, they're still ongoing, and I shouldn't be in a position where I'm confirming X versus Y and making commitments on behalf of other countries. These are long-standing challenges that have existed. It would be remiss to try to say we figured it out and it's done, and that's not the position or the posture that we're taking. We are facilitating. We are trying to play a positive role. We are trying to play a constructive role to bring more alignment with all of these different entities that you have flagged. And yes, when we were in Ethiopia, we made commitment for investment, and we will be looking at the types of sectors that make most sense for both of us, and we've studied what those would look like and what return, not from an investment standpoint. I go back to meaningful impact for the people, because at the end of the day, if it's just about investing a dollar figure, you put it in one of your fancy funds in New York. This has to be much larger than that, because it has implications as well that are much larger in a region that is also primarily young. The demographic of our region is primarily young. So you have to look at things like job creation, and you have to look at some of these elements in ICT and in innovation to ensure that the commitment that is being put forward is actually one that will result in meaningful impact.
Thank you. Next, Peter Salisbury.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry for sneaking in late there. I just want to come back to this point of post-conflict planning for Yemen, and maybe turn the lens a little bit more towards DDR. towards what happens with the various military forces on the ground. A lot of the military...
Sorry, turn the question to what? DDR?
DDR. Disarmament, decommissioning, and reintegration. We're seeing a lot of fairly diffuse military forces operating on the ground in Yemen under the auspices of the coalition and the government of Yemen. I mean, when you look at the Red Sea coast all the way up to Hodeidah, we've got the Giants Brigade, we've got Tariq Saleh's Guards of the Republic or Republican Guards, we've got the Tahami Resistance, and now we've got the Presidential Protection Forces becoming involved as well. These guys aren't historically the best of friends, and many of the forces on the ground today across the south have been trained and equipped by the UAE. And what I'm interested to hear from you is how, in the context of post-conflict, especially after the events in Aden this January, we're going to see deconfliction of these forces, how they're going to be disarmed and reintegrated themselves. I'd love to hear any thoughts you have to share on that.
So those are complex issues that we've also spoken to Martin about. The post-conflict plan that we are nascently putting together is on development. Obviously, disarmament or disarming the different types of forces within Yemen adds another dimension of complexity, especially as you look at who will oversee this disarmament and who will monitor it, and if it doesn't happen, then what are repercussions for it. So these are all measures that the Special Envoy is looking at and is studying to see how they can, if they say square a circle or circle a square. But really, the post-conflict work that I've been involved with has really been on the development side.
Can I push that?
Sure, you can.
That conversation that is happening with Abu Dhabi, to your knowledge, that people are looking at how, since we're training, equipping, in many cases, sort of guiding these forces, what the UAE did. Is that a conversation that's happening?
Not to my knowledge. It's not my direct remit. But the post-conflict on development is happening. Thank you.
I've had a conversation with Martin, and this is one of his most critical, but also one of his most challenging issues. I suspect this is going to be one of the things that is on the agenda when they have full-fledged negotiations at some point. But the question is, which militias get incorporated, which ones get disbanded? That's going to be a tough one, but it's for Martin and the Yemeni factions to figure out together.
Okay, Mimi, I think you're next.
Your Excellency, thank you for coming and speaking with us today. It's a pleasure to meet you. My question has to do with Iran and how the coalition and or the UN are negotiating with Iran to stop the conflict in Yemen, and how are they influencing them to have the Houthis accept some of the UN proposals, especially in Al Hodeidah?
We're not speaking to Iran about this.
Is UN speaking to
I'd
Iran?
let the UN speak on what they're speaking about.
Okay.
Do you want to add something?
I don't know, honestly.
Okay, I think Eugenia Davis.
Hi, I'm UAE Desk Officer at Department of State. I've been on the desk for about a year, and so some of the most challenging issues that we look at have to do with sort of a balance between pressure and trust. Yemen is an example. When we're looking at the possibility of successful negotiations with the Houthis, the question comes up, can we trust them? When we look at other issues in the region, the same question comes up, can we trust the other countries in the region to make good on their promises and to do what they claim to be doing? I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the ways in which the UAE attempts to build trust in order to solve these regional conflicts. You could start with Yemen if that's an easy starting place.
If it's easier?
Yeah.
You know the saying, of course, that trust is earned, right? So maybe I don't start with Yemen because it's more complex, but in the relationships that we've had and in those that we've seen grow and grow exponentially and grow very well, it has been because we've been able to achieve a level of confidence and trust, and that confidence and trust was also reciprocated. I think it's important to note that these things have to be on both ends, and hence my earlier comment to you, Kristen, on where are you guys going. I mentioned the necessity of alignment with leadership also, because you have some pretty great heads of government that may just simply not be interested in our part of the world and have their own focus. So that alignment and therefore that mutual understanding is very important. And it needs to be demonstrated over a series of initiatives and also over some time. With Yemen, I think the issue is because of so many years of if I may even say, failed attempts or failed outcomes rather. We need to think through creatively about a setup or a framework that almost doesn't allow for something to fail, that allows all different parties that, quote, legitimate voice so that they have their way of making it through. And I think trust will take a very long time amongst themselves, given the historical context at which this has operated. But I also believe that certainly amongst the newer generation, not only of Yemenis, but in all places, and we can talk of Syria and we can talk of other places like Iraq, there is a renewed sense of wanting to have a better life and therefore trying to put that past behind them. I hope I'm not naive in this assessment, but I think the promise of what could be is sometimes stronger than what has happened in the past. And if you create a setup or you create a political framework that allows to promote what could be, then that could be also contagious and people might actually want to live that way too.
Is blank. Is there anyone else who would like to step in? Norman, Rule, please.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the presentation. It was quite interesting. I was wondering if you would comment on the UAE's program regarding child soldiers in Yemen. The United Nations recently came out with a report where they discussed this issue. And obviously this is part of the post-conflict development phase. But if you could comment on anything that's occurring right now to include what is being done to discourage the use of child soldiers by some of the Yemeni government forces. Thank you.
So this is something that we're very concerned about. We are looking very closely at not only that report, but at also other actors on the ground who have information on the matter. The UAE takes the right of the child very, very seriously. In fact, later on in the year, we're hosting something with the government on Italy for the rights of the child. So this is an area of, I wouldn't even say interest, I would say of prime importance. The violations and the significant humanitarian laws that the Houthis have broken in the recruitment, training, and abuse of these children is abhorrent, to say the least. And certainly the UAE looks at ways in which we can also try to help rehabilitate and try to help mitigate as much as we possibly can.
Thanks. Peyton, I believe you're next.
Thank you both very much. Maybe just to return briefly to the Horn of Africa and perhaps follow up on something that Steve raised earlier. You both have spoken very eloquently about a lot of these actions, recent actions and developments, being animated by a longer-term sort of strategic vision of your government's role in the world. When we look at sort of the Horn of Africa, there's no shortage, obviously, of conflict and tensions, right? Steve alluded to whether that's between Sudan and Egypt, whether it's within some of these countries, within Sudan, within Somalia. Of course, the Emirates is deeply engaged as well. My question is, I wonder to what extent the historic but still nascent, as you said, progress in the rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea is a model for similar efforts going forward to diffuse tension, to mediate between or mediate long-standing rivalries and conflicts, whether those are between states in the region or even within states, where the UAE can bring to bear some of its both political and economic leverage.
I think it's incredibly motivating. It's very inspirational. The folks that we speak to, but also the region itself, are very, very inspired by this. I know of at least 2 previous, quote, mediators who have tried for a very long time that are African to bring about some form of closeness between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And it has been mired with so many challenges. So the fact that this is happening will absolutely have a very big spillover effect. And I would argue not just in Africa. I think it's a model of reconciliation in other parts of the world as well. And I feel very privileged to have been part of witnessing how this has unfolded. And I cannot underestimate it's not about a feel-good factor, because you can get over that pretty quickly, but it will have long-term, tangible impact as the communities of both interact, build ties, build bridges that will continue to leave that positive impact for generations and for many geographies to come in other places.
And I think any mediator's ability to succeed or fail largely depends on how the parties view the mediator. So to Eugenia's earlier question about trust and confidence, I think in the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea, where it's been successful, is because both parties trust the role that we have played in bringing them together. Both parties trust the role that we are not in this for ourselves. And so I think to the extent we can do this with countries we've built these relationships and build this trust with, it might work. But if we go to a part of the world where we don't know them and they don't know us and attempt to mediate in the same way, it won't succeed.
Can I just follow up quickly on that? It's a very interesting point. I guess my question is more the extent to which you anticipate, at least in the immediate sort of broader region, Horn of Africa, the proximity. If you anticipate that undertaking similar efforts in to diffuse other conflicts.
I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the parties involved, right? If you have a couple friend of yours and you try to help, if they're not getting along and you're trying to help them, if they don't want to get along, it doesn't matter how much you try. At the end of the day, I think this is going to come down to the parties involved, and our assessment will be, if we can bring this about, it's worth a try, but if we can't, and if they don't want to work out, then this is fine. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. It's hard to draw a standard approach to this.
Thanks. On this side of the table, we had Kristen, and is it Aya? I'm sorry. Yara, sorry.
Speaking of parties that don't want to get along, I wanted to bring things a bit closer back home to the Gulf. And obviously, we've had a huge split in the Gulf between the Quartet countries and Qatar, which doesn't show many signs, and I'd love to break some news if you see any signs of promise on that front. But I have kind of a broader question about that, of sort of where does the Gulf figure in the UAE's both sort of strategy and also just sort of imagination? Because I get the sense that kind of the UAE has been looking to the stronger partnership with Saudi Arabia, which has been a very important kind of strategic alliance, and looking to these broader partnerships that extend outside of the Gulf. We just got the announcement yesterday that I guess we're trying to understand that Saudi Arabia also has created a bilateral relationship with Kuwait right now. So I'm just sort of wondering, where do you see, as somebody who's been a Gulf specialist and works at an Arab Gulf States Institute, do you see things in terms of the Gulf or Gulf partners, or is that any more kind of a priority in the way that the UAE views the world?
Yeah, absolutely. The GCC continues to be incredibly strong. Our relationship is not just with Saudi, with Bahrain, with Oman. That plays a very important role with Kuwait. Unfortunately, last year we had to cut ties with Qatar for a whole set of reasons that you're all very well aware of. We hope they come back to the GCC fold. It is their natural habitat. We've made very clear what needs to happen for that to happen. But we're not choosing relationships in lieu of our immediate neighborhood. And we're certainly not picking one versus the others. There may be different intensities in those relationships by virtue of what we're also doing collectively or together. But I would award a lot of importance to our relationship with Oman and with Bahrain and with Kuwait in addition to Saudi.
So yeah, it's strengthening our bilateral relationship with countries don't come at the expense of multilateral. So we have a very strong bilateral relationship where we have a committee with France, for example. I don't think anyone's going to go accuse France of undermining the EU. We have the same thing with Singapore. So these types of relationships are, in the national interests of the UAE. Does not mean they have to come at the expense of another country or a multilateral organization. Our relationship with Saudi is the same thing. We decided to strengthen that relationship because we have a common vision of the region, and again, that began well before the rift. And so I know people try to inject the rift into kind of how they analyze things in the Gulf, but the reality is it really has had very little impact on anything, on the GCC, on our bilateral relationships with other countries. And if I can make a plug over here, my friend Norm Rule wrote a very eloquent and thoughtful piece on the GCC and how it's probably going to survive based on his experience and knowledge of this issue.
All right, we're going to take... Yeah, that was nice. $5 more. We have 3 more on the list, and then I think we might take a break. Yara, you're next.
Thank you. I'm Yara from Reuters. Just a couple of questions to pick up on the GCC rift. I just wondered what your view is, given the administration's line, the U.S. administration's line here, that the rift, they say that the reason why they feel the rift needs to be resolved is because it undermines, the U.S.'s allies in terms of confronting Iran. Do you see that as having any kind of practical measure at all? And what is your response to the administration when they put out that kind of reasoning for why the rift needs to be fixed? And then secondly, on Hodeidah, you've said that you're all in on the envoy's efforts. I'm wondering for how long? I mean, what are you waiting to see? What are the red lines there? How long are you willing to give him to carry on with the efforts that he's giving? And if he does come back with a solution that is, specific to Hodeidah as opposed to all of Yemen, would this be something that you would entertain?
I take this one and you take the U.S. one? Yeah, the U.S. position. So we believe very much in what the special envoy is doing. We don't have a deadline for him, but we also...
Deadlines would actually undermine his efforts.
Right. We feel that, he needs to do what he needs to do, and he's perhaps one of the first to say that time's not on our side. These things can't drag out for too long, because when they do, they end up not being very effective. As long as there is a solution, whether it is, if we're looking at only Hodeidah, then it has to be port and city, and it has to be in accordance with 2216. There is an opportunity to use Hodeidah for something larger, but if that doesn't work, it doesn't work. But what we're interested in, and the reason why we are looking at Hodeidah very closely, is because of the port and city. So we're not going to forego one because we were ambitious or optimistic to have a solution to a larger problem. It makes the situation more difficult down the line, because then it becomes even harder to try to have a peaceful settlement in Yemen as a whole. However, we will take whatever he can get that actually maintains the integrity of a full withdrawal from port and city.
So the U.S. administration's concern on the rift, I think, is that a prolonged rift risks undermining the GCC or the GCC falls apart. And it's not our intention to undermine the GCC or to make sure the GCC falls apart. We have some very serious concerns about what Qatar has been doing in the region for the last 15 years. Those concerns have been brought up, have never been really addressed. A perfect example of how they weren't addressed is when we went through this in 2014 and it failed. And so this is not a new phenomenon. The GCC survived 2014, it'll survive this. And despite the concerns, I would challenge anybody to name one thing that they want to do collectively with us on Iran that hasn't been done because of the rift. Cooperation between us and the US and the Saudis have gone on very well. Sanctions are going to come down. The rift hasn't affected that. So I think in the short term, military operations, exercises, all of these continue as scheduled. And the issue with Qatar has not impacted it whatsoever. So even my interactions with the administration lately have not addressed anything about the rift because we've all come to the conclusion that life goes on, and until we find a way to make them realize that the solution to this is by working with us, not by working in Washington, this doesn't get resolved. But even though now that we've had this issue on the table for about a year, there has been no multilateral impact to it in terms of U.S. operations or the Iran file whatsoever.
Thanks. We're going to stop the questions a little bit early. So on my list, I still have Eric Polovsky and Ambassador Leaf just put her card up. So if you want to just maybe ask the questions, both of you, and then we can respond all at the same time.
Well, I know it's not on the agenda, but I'll ask it anyway. You know, as a government servant, that's the risk you get when you appear before us. What does your government want done on Syria? What does your government want done on Syria? What does it want the administration to do? And are you seeing any prospect of that?
Eric, do you want to pose your question too, just to put it on the table?
Sure. As long as we're going out of region, just have a quick question on Russia, because it's sort of, that's the fever of the day. Russian involvement in Libya has been a little bit of a sine curve, and I'm just curious where you think the Russians are on that sine curve these days in Libya.
Because I don't know.
I hate to say that I actually don't know what the Russian position is on Libya that I would be comfortable enough to discuss with you. But I have some speculation. I'm happy to speak to you about it offline. But given how this is on the record, I need to know what I'm saying before I go ahead with that. And Yusuf will take Syria.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to surprise anyone. Our concern with Syria is obviously the Iranian presence. And so we still don't know what the solution for Syria looks like 7 years later. I don't know if the meeting in Helsinki brought us any closer to some kind of understanding between the two major players in Syria today outside of Iran. And so what we want is very clear. Whether it can happen or not, I have no idea.
All right, we're going to end on that not so optimistic note. She asked the question. She did. It's fair enough. But please join me in thanking Her Excellency Reem Al Hashimy and Ambassador Yusuf Al Otaiba for joining us so frankly today and being open to these questions. You're all welcome to stay for coffee and talk amongst yourselves off the record. And we hope that when you're next in Washington that you will again come and visit us. So thank you very much.